tonight's lecture is to be given by our panel of 4 speakers, chaired by Charles Draper. Charles Draper is chairman of the Herschel Society and has also been the chairman of Bath and Surround's Starlit Skes Alliance since 2019. Bob Misen is coordinator of the Commission for Dark Skies, a section of the British Astronomical Association which works with the Dark Skies group of MPs in Parliament. Bob Fosbury is an astrophysicist with 26 years' experience with the European Space Agency on the Hubble project. He currently holds an honorary professorship at the UCL Institute of Ophthalmology, where he works on the interactions of light of different wavelengths on biological processes, notably in mitochondria. And Sophie Spencer has been director at CPRE, Avon and Bristol since 2014 and has developed knowledge and expertise in rural policy, including light pollution. Let me hand you over to Charles Draper.
Tony, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, from me. This is my title slide, and let's see if I can go on. Okay, so the outline that we're talking about, can you see the whole slide, by the way? Because the, okay, let's go back one. Let's go back one if I can. Right. I think it's obvious to most people that light pollution is an issue that affects astronomers and is bad for astronomers, both professional and amateur. But in recent years, it's been increasingly harmful. That obviously it's harmful in many ways to human and animal health. And this broadens the need to control it, to being much more of an issue for society in generally, rather than just a specific group who wants to look at the night sky. And we will outline some thoughts about this from 4 perspectives, and then open it up for general discussion. But one thing I will clarify, because there's a sort of another issue that has come up more recently. I'm talking about light pollution in the form of artificial lighting generated by people that prevents us from enjoying the night sky. There's now a separate issue generated by modern fleets of microsatellites in the night sky, and which you may have seen for yourselves. And they're actually quite a difficult issue for professional astronomy. But it's a separate issue because this is about controlling what some big corporations do and controlling how they are governed internationally, because space is a rather curious area for the use of the rule of law. And the Royal Astronomical Society is actually coordinating some work on that under Robert Massey. We're not talking about that tonight, and the impact is indeed rather different. So we're talking about human-generated light pollution, what it does, and we have our 4 speakers. Bob Misen will give his perspective from as the coordinator for the Commission on Dark Skies, and then Bob Fosbury will talk about a particular aspect of some wavelengths of light that are increasingly obviously hazardous to human health. Sophie Spencer will give a perspective from her commission's point of view, a countryside perspective, if you like, and I'll talk about it because I'm now leading the Bath and Surrounds Starlit Skes Alliance, which campaigns on the issue for the Bath area. But I'll come back to that at the end, and then we have the open forum. So we'll run that order. So I shall now hand over to Bob Misen.
Thank you very much, Charles. I belong to the BAA Commission for Dark Skies. That's the British Astronomical Association's Commission for Dark Skies. This was founded 32 years ago by a group of concerned astronomers who realized that during their lifetimes, the night sky had begun rather seriously to disappear over their heads. Not all of them lived in towns and cities. In rural areas too, because one of the first things we learn in physics is that light travels. And if you go to anywhere on the British mainland, you will never see a totally dark natural night sky because of the light that escapes mostly from cities, but also from small villages towns, etc. That particular meeting engendered the Campaign for Dark Skies, as it was then called, later changed to Commission for Dark Skies. And you can see here one of the places that is a protected dark sky area. This is Galloway Forest Park in southwest Scotland. And all over the UK, there are international dark sky reserves, dark sky parks, dark sky communities. Remember, these are not protected by law. There is no law to protect the night sky. They are protected by the hardworking people within the national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty who run the places, and they do their best to keep light pointing where it's needed. One thing that must be stressed, I can't stress it enough, the Commission for Dark Skies is not about turning lights off. We do not wish to turn off any single useful, necessary light. We're quite happy to see unnecessary lights turned off, but that's another story. And the next slide. Charles, next slide, please. Ian Phillips was the chairman of the Landscape Institute, and he's now on the board of the South Downs National Park Authority. The South Downs National Park is one of Britain's dark sky areas. And this is what he said at a meeting I went to in Kew, which was, I think, about 2009. And too much lighting isn't planned, it just happens. Just think about this, too much lighting isn't planned. Look around you when you're outside, not necessarily at night, anytime. Look at the exterior lights. Don't do this while you're driving or anything like that. And see where they point. Nearly all exterior lighting points in the wrong place. The left-hand picture shows a race course in a rural area. It's a horse racing course, and you can see that when its floodlights are lit at night, an enormous amount of the light goes upwards and causes this sort of mushroom effect in the clouds. The right-hand picture shows a very, very typical...
No, not in there.
Thousands
Where's
of
the sea
these.
salt bag?
Can you mute, please, whoever's not muted there? Thank you. Thousands of these things are sold all the time. They come in containers, mostly from China, and they have no light control whatsoever.
Did you go to the loo?
And Ronnie, mute,
Please.
please. Ronnie, can you mute?
Okay, let's carry on. The light source in this particular fitting is a small yellow rectangle in the middle. It's an LED. And as you can see, the light is mounted in such a way that about a third of it goes upwards. It is possible, you can see the bracket there, to point this light down towards the small car park, which it's supposed to illuminate. But most of these units have very little in the way of instruction, and many of them can't even be tilted downwards because they're not designed like that. So at the moment, private lighting in this country is pure anarchy. You can do whatever you like with them. You can point them in any direction, and nobody can do anything about it. As a pressure group, we get emails. I nearly said letters there. That's a long time ago. We get emails from people who are severely troubled by light entering their premises. They can't sleep. I've visited the houses of people who nail plywood up against the windows because their neighbours won't re-angle the lights. I've had letters and emails from people contemplating suicide because of the massive amount of light that bounces around this country and robs them of sleep. It really is that bad. This is a definite problem. The bottom picture shows something of the cultural aspect of light pollution. Behind that light is Stonehenge, arguably Western Europe's most significant astronomically aligned ancient monument. And that's a golf driving range in front of Stonehenge. This is on a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And yet the light is there. Somebody, presumably at Wiltshire Council, thought this might be a good idea. I really don't know why. Next slide, please. So the planning process in this country allows things like that to happen. There are some things that you can't do to the environment, for example, fly tipping. This photo was taken in a wood, not far from where I live in Dorset. And of course, if you're seen doing this, if you're caught doing this, if it can be shown that you did this, then you can be fined hundreds of pounds. If you keep doing it, you can go to prison. Recently, a person in Essex was jailed for 2 years for constantly, continually tipping concrete on arable land, which isn't really a nice thing to do. So you can be fined for fouling beaches, you can be fined for destroying crops, you can be fined for throwing supermarket trolleys in rivers, despoiling streams. There's almost no part of the environment that isn't protected in this country, except for the sky. At night, the starry sky is half of our environment. It's 50% of your environment, and yet it has no protection whatsoever in law. Next slide, please. So the right-hand picture shows something that doesn't carry a penalty. This is permitted. You might be able to guess that it's actually a sports ground. It's one of these all-weather sports pitches, hockey, tennis, football, and the old-fashioned sodium light on the left, the orange one, is pointed more or less where it ought to be, which is down on the premises to be lit. But the sports lights, you'll notice that there's nobody actually playing football, tennis, or hockey up in the sky there. So why is the light there? Quite simply because in this country, you can point a light wherever you like, you can get it wrong like this, and nobody can do anything about it. The text below mentions the fact that there's only one law in this country to deal with light pollution, and that's about light into premises. It's almost never properly enforced, partly because council officials who get complaints about neighbours' lights shining into bedrooms tend to work during the daytime. And they visit the offender or the offended person during the daytime. They look at the lights, they say, well, we're not quite sure, it looks a fairly normal light, it's not over bright, etc. And they don't really see the effect at night. A strange thing about this law, which is the Clean Neighbourhoods and Environment Act 2005, is that transport premises are exempt from this law. If a bus station, a lorry park, a harbour, something like this connected with transport shines lights into your windows so that you're severely discomfited by it, you can't sleep or something, nobody can do anything because they're transport premises. For years, I have tried to find out why they're exempt. Nobody can or will tell me. DEFRA, for example, they cannot answer this question. It's just the law. The next slide shows rural light pollution. Many people have the fond idea that as soon as you leave the town or city, you get nice dark skies. It isn't true. Rural areas do have little industrial estates, they have businesses, they have shops, they have all sorts of places where lighting is needed. This is a very small village in Dorset. It's on the Cranbourne Chase area of outstanding natural beauty, which a couple of years ago became Britain's most recent dark sky reserve. This is under the scheme fostered by the International Dark Sky Association, which is an American organization, and all over the world they have a scheme whereby dark landscapes can be protected. They can call themselves dark sky parks, reserves, communities, and as I said, there's nothing legal about this. It's just an agreement that the people who run these places will try hard to keep light pollution to the minimum. What you're seeing is a small industrial estate. That's one light that's causing that particular pollution. The light is presumably supposed to light the premises with the light, but it doesn't happen, of course, because it's been misdirected. The diagram below comes from our old friends, the Institution of Lighting Professionals. You mustn't think that lighting professionals, people who manufacture and sell lights, are our enemies. Nearly all of the lights they make are pretty good things. And they've got rules about installation. But of course, this doesn't apply to imported so-called security lights. There's no connection whatsoever between lighting and crime levels. You can research this for yourself if you like. And so they shouldn't really be called security lights. They're exterior lights. This is what the ILP says. You can see it on the diagram. The task light, the white area, is the light that's needed by the owner of the light. The illumination of that particular area where activity will take place. Spill light, you can see it going over the little boundary there, which looks a bit like a golf flag in the middle. Spill light is light that goes onto other premises and onto places that don't necessarily want to be lit, but the light can spill over onto them if it's not pointed properly. Upward light, of course, is what causes sky glow. The atmosphere is full of billions of tiny particles, aerosols, droplets, pollen grains, dust, all sorts of things, and that material scatters this upward light and sends it back down again. So it's an interesting fact, isn't it, that light pollution isn't actually light going upwards, it's the light coming back downwards that you see. Just a little oddity of light pollution. So thank you, Institution of Lighting Professionals, Britain's major sort of keynote body on lighting practices, for bringing out diagrams like this. And on their website, theilp.org, you'll find huge numbers of guidance notes and how to do it right, best practice. Isn't it sad that the law doesn't actually try to enforce such things? We'd save an enormous amount of money, of course, if lighting were regulated, because then lighting wouldn't have to be so bright if it was correctly directed. And we all know what happens when you use too much energy. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about biodiversity. Next slide, please. I wrote this. I'm quite happy with it, really. The light from distant stars and galaxies takes hundreds, thousands, even millions of years to reach our eyes. What a tragedy to lose it in the last millisecond of its journey. All that light coming from distant galaxies. On the left there, you can see a galaxy. It's called the Milky Way. It's the one you live in. It has dark dust clouds. These are the ashes of ancient generations of stars which have died, and those stars within their bodies, the sun does this too, it's just an ordinary star. Within their bodies, they've made elements. Every element was made inside a star, with the exception of hydrogen, which was made by the Big Bang that kick-started the universe about 14,000 million years ago. That dust is important. It's what you're made of. That dust contains the carbon, the oxygen, the, recipe for a human being, all sorts of things we have in our bodies, don't we? Iron, calcium, teeth, blood, etc. And it's all up there in those black clouds. The stars are our chemical parents. They made the atoms of which we are made. So I think we ought to be able to see them. This is a little philosophical point about light pollution. Our chemical parents are being hidden from about 90% of us by light pollution. That's very sad. Next slide, please. So is anything happening about light pollution? It's been getting worse now for decades. You can see there a picture, for example, taken not far away from Bath, at a place called Cologne, I believe. It's a rural area, but you can see the light spill from towns, from the motorway service area at Lee Delamere, Cheltenham, you can see, Chippenham rather, you can see there, Trowbridge, Bristol, Bath down bottom left. You can also see Comet Hale-Bopp. Can you see it on the right-hand side there, little tiny comet? And that dates the picture at 1997, I think. Yeah. So in a rural area, the sky is tainted all around the horizon here. The other picture was taken on the island of Sark. There aren't too many lights on the island of Sark because not very many people live there. There are no cars, for example. And lighting is kept to a minimum, especially since Sark became one of these dark sky communities. And there are steps taken now to make sure that house lights and yard lights and things like this are pointing in the right direction. Next, please. If you're wondering, that's a tin mine, an abandoned tin mine in Cornwall. And at the other end of the country, just to show the sort of extent of the UK here, that's a picture taken in Shetland. That's what the oil industry has done to the night skies of northern Scotland. They don't need to shine lights upwards. Most of the work takes place on the ground, I believe, even under it. And so why is this enormous glow appearing from a Scottish island? Well, nobody knows, really, do they? It's just because it's permitted. Next slide, please. They said that LEDs, nearly all modern lights are LEDs. You won't see anything else in an exterior light in about 20 years' time, I'm sure. It was said that LEDs would solve the problem. They are highly versatile lights. They're energy efficient. They don't have nasty waste products, for example. They don't use a lot of power. They can be adjusted. They can switch on and off instantaneously, unlike the old sodium lamps, which glowed balefully for a few minutes before they came on. That's just to remind me that I've got to stop soon. Okay, so isn't it the fact that they've solved the problem? No, it isn't, because they're nearly always too bright for the job, and they are usually the ones chosen by your local council, for example. They're usually blue rich. Blue rich is daylight. Blue rich turns night into day. If you're an invertebrate or a bat or an owl, any night creature, you don't really want night to become day, because like us, these creatures have evolved for millions of years to have a night and a day. We are programmed to live the circadian day-night rhythm. And if it's taken away from us, something very serious, I think, will happen. Next slide, please, very quickly now. This is Edvard Munch. You're familiar with this painting, I'm sure. It's called The Scream. And Munch said, I was walking along the road, I felt this melancholy, the sky was a bloody red, and I was tired to death. I felt a vast, infinite scream through nature. Most people think that this picture is called The Scream because the person is screaming. No, that's Edvard Munch with his hands to his ears because he cannot bear to hear the scream of nature. It's nature that's screaming. And later on, Munch tried to explain what he meant by this. And he said in an interview in the 1890s, an expression of the irreversible impact of civilization on nature. And to this day, it goes on, and it's got much, much worse. We've all heard of the biodiversity collapse. We've all heard of climate change. We've all heard of a climate emergency. Light pollution plays its part in this. It's an enormous waste of energy and money, of course. And its impact on biodiversity, well, I have a quotation here. A few days ago, there was a debate in Parliament about light pollution and biodiversity, and a DEFRA minister said, based on the currently available evidence, artificial light is not identified as one of the main drivers of species decline. Sorry, Minister, you're absolutely wrong. I was talking to a lighting professional from the ILP the other day, and he said it's almost absolutely, definitely true that light pollution is probably the third biggest enemy of invertebrates, night creatures, after pesticides and farm management, it's probably the third biggest factor in the decline of biodiversity in this country. We must try to convince Parliament and the all-party parliamentary group of MPs who concentrate on dark skies are doing this. There is a group in Parliament pushing for the light pollution agenda. Next, please. That photo behind the screen was taken from Portsmouth. It's the Northern Lights, yeah, from the south coast. I've seen it from my garden here in Wimborne in Dorset dozens of times. The reason you don't see it is possibly because you don't look for it. This kind of thing is being stolen from people by light pollution. Yes, it's an astronomer's problem. No, it isn't just an astronomer's problem. It's your problem. It's the problem of almost every living thing on this planet. And as the huge habitat of night is eaten away, eroded and frayed around the edges, nasty things are beginning to happen. Next slide, please. So support the all-party parliamentary group for dark skies. The government must prioritise the climate crisis. At the moment, it isn't really doing that. And the habitat of darkness must be repaired. Blue rich lighting must be outlawed. Next slide, please. This kind of sight must become a common thing outside towns and cities, not a rarity. Next slide, please. We need regulation of lighting, not guidelines. Guidelines can be thrown in a bin. We need no blue rich light, 3000 Kelvin color temperature. It never says these things on the packaging. Ought to be the norm. Okay. Next slide, please. And the next, I think there's an extra one crept in there. France, Mexico, South Korea, Liechtenstein, would you believe? Little Liechtenstein, and various other countries and regions have night sky protection statutes. In France, you're not allowed to shine a light above the horizontal. We can do this. The British government must be persuaded to do this. It can be done. Light pollution is a bigger problem than most people think. I will now shut up. Thank you very much. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Bob
and I'll hand you over to Bob Fosbury, who's going to talk about light and life.
Thank you. I'll stay on that slide for a moment, please, Charles. Well, I'm really taking over where Bob Misen gave us an introduction in the second part of his talk. Why are we concerned about the interactions of light with biology? Why don't we want blue light? How should we be careful about illuminating ourselves at the wrong time? Well, I'm going to try and give you a rather brief overview of this. It's a very active research project at the time, all over the world, and we're learning a lot, and we don't understand exactly how everything works yet, but we're working very hard on it. Now, you're probably aware that light builds and powers most of the life that you see around us on the planet. Photosynthesis produces all your food. It produces most of the energy we use now, with the exception of things like nuclear power. All the fossil fuel power that we're using, or abusing, probably it's a more apposite way of saying it, all of that fossil fuel power was driven by sunlight. It's captured sunlight. And photosynthesis does two things. One thing is that it builds plants, including all the sugars and the nutrients which feed all the animals, and including us. And the other thing it does is to produce oxygen as a waste product. And we use the combination of the food and the oxygen to power ourselves, and other animals do the same. We respire, we burn food to make energy. Now, this all started not in the very early stages of life. If we go back more than 3 billion years to the very earliest life that we know about, Oxygen was a rarity at that time. In fact, oxygen was highly toxic. And the early life used chemical energy from elements around it at the time. And it was only later that sunlight, was exploited through this molecule called chlorophyll to produce sugars and produce the building blocks of plants, and eventually, somewhat later, to power animal life. Now, can we go to the first proper slide now, please, Charles? There was something called the Great Oxygenation Event that happened between 2.4 and 2 billion years ago. Up until then, as I said, life had thrived in a delicate balance between exploiting sunlight as its source of energy and surviving its exposure to the toxic oxygen that was beginning to be produced in that era, that photosynthesis emits as a waste product. The production of oxygen had many effects on the planet. It's a planet-wide effect that not only affected life, but also affected rocks and plate tectonics and all of those things. With O2 in the atmosphere, the UV sunlight generated the ozone, which is 3 oxygen atoms rather than 2, tied together in a rather unstable partnership. The ozone layer allowed life to emerge from the oceans into a more benign light environment. Once it did that, for the last 500 million years or so, life has adapted to exploit the virtues of oxygen, that is, burning food to make energy, whilst managing its toxic effects. Now, one of those adaptations was an adaptation to day and night, and the modulation of light levels throughout the day and night, we think, allows essential light-averse processes to happen in the dark. Now, if we remove this opportunity by shining daylight on the planet at nighttime, we not only put ourselves in peril, but we also put in peril much of Earth's life, not only animals, but also plants. Can we have the next slide, please? This is the only sort of really meaty slide I have in the presentation. And this is the presentation of the spectrum of sunlight. So I should explain briefly, if you look vertically in this diagram, you have the brightness of the light. And if you look horizontally from left to right, you go from far ultraviolet on the left, through ultraviolet, through blue, through the rest of the visible spectrum and into the infrared. And the spectra I have plotted on this diagram are, first of all, the sun. The white spectrum at the top represents the sun outside our atmosphere. So this is the sunlight that comes to planet Earth from the sun directly before it makes the transition through the atmosphere. When it goes through the atmosphere, many things happen, mostly towards the ultraviolet and the blue. It wipes out the ultraviolet because of the ozone in the atmosphere. And that's the purple zone in the spectrum on the left there. That and what's left of that is ultraviolet light. Then comes the blue light, which is also scattered to make the blue sky and also absorbed to some extent. And then as we move into the red, more of the sunlight gets through, but when we go into the infrared, the orange lines there represent the absorption due to water vapor in the atmosphere. So we lose quite a lot of the infrared in absorption by water, and that's one of the main greenhouse gases that heats our planet. Now, what I want to do in this diagram is to point out 3 color regions where very important interactions happen between light and animals and plants. I'm going to talk principally about the animals. If we start with the purple region on the left, this is the ultraviolet light, which gets absorbed largely by ozone, but begins to get through the atmosphere in the somewhat brighter purple band that I've drawn, vertical band in the diagram. And that's the region where the light interacting with our skin allows us to synthesize vitamin D. You will have heard a lot about vitamin D during the pandemic. It's extremely valuable, essential for many aspects of life, not only building your bones, but building your skeletons, but also for protecting you against infections and so on. So it has very many functions in the body, and is an essential vitamin, actually a hormone rather than a vitamin, but it's absolutely essential for life. So that's one region where the interaction of light with animals is very is essential and very productive. Unfortunately, that's the region where you get sunburned and where you can suffer from overexposures, which can produce skin cancers. So that's a very delicate region to manage, but it is an essential interaction. When we go to the blue, a different kind of interaction occurs. This is an interaction where light interacts directly with molecules in our bodies and in the bodies of all animals, and indeed in plants as well, where light interacts with chemicals called porphyrins. Porphyrins are very important chemicals that are responsible for most of the plant colors that you see around you. Not all of them, but most. They're also extremely important because they're the chemicals from which chlorophyll and hemoglobin, plants and animals, are synthesized directly. But they're very dangerous elements. They're very dangerous molecules when light is shining on them. And in particular, blue light can stimulate porphyrins to generate what we call reactive oxygen species. These are what all the antioxidants that you use try to get rid of, because they damage cells. They're like throwing hand grenades into cells. But in fact, they also do very positive things. They do a lot of signaling between cells. So you actually have to be rather careful about how you manage them. And I think the important point I'd like to make is that it's probably true that our bodies have adapted to cope with the blue light in daytime, to avoid doing this damage to their cells in daytime. But in nighttime, the body becomes very sensitive to the effects of blue light, because the blue light will make these reactive oxygens and do a lot of damage in cells. You'll probably have heard your opticians saying they want to sell you glasses which filter out blue light. And the reason they do that is they know that blue light does damage, particularly to your eyes. But it probably only does damage in the night, not so much during the daytime. Now, the third spectrum marked on this diagram is the dashed yellow line in the middle, which shows the radiation coming from one of the LEDs that Bob Misen was showing you, the very white LEDs, the 4,000 Kelvin LEDs that are becoming ubiquitous for street lighting these days. And you'll notice that there's this strong peak in the blue region of the spectrum, which comes in this region, which I call the danger zone. This is where the reactive oxygen species are constructed in cells if they're irradiated with blue light at the wrong time. This is very much what happens when you have a radioactive disaster in Hiroshima or in Chernobyl. It's the radiation which creates reactive oxygen species which kill you. Light does exactly the same thing. It doesn't generate quite as many, but it does exactly the same thing. Now, unfortunately, these modern lights are driven by that blue emission. And the emission you see, the other bump you see slightly to the red, is produced inside the lamp as a result of the blue light exciting phosphors in the lamps. That the blue light is always there. It's strongest in the lamps which are brighter white, the high color temperature lamps. Bob Misen mentioned that you shouldn't use lamps with a color temperature higher than 3,000 kelvins. That's the reason, because you want to reduce that blue peak. So that's something we can't allow to happen. It's becoming ubiquitous around the planet. Almost all the new street lighting that's being produced is lights like this, which are doing untold damage to ourselves and to animals and to some extent to plants. Let me just move on to the red band here. The red band is a similar kind of interaction between light and biology, but in this case, it's immensely productive. This is the band of light where most of the photosynthesis occurs. So this is what builds plants, what builds most of our food. And in fact, what we're learning at the moment is that shining red light on ourselves at certain times of day in moderation can very much improve the operation of our bodies and perhaps save us from macular degeneration, which is a very serious eye disease for older people. And one characteristic as you move into the red part of the spectrum is that all tissues, bodies and plants, become much more transparent. So red light can penetrate your bodies and do very positive things inside your bodies. So that was a brief coverage of 3 regions of the spectrum, 2 of which are largely beneficial and 1 of which is extremely destructive. And that 1 in the middle is blue. And this is the reason we have to get rid of blue light at night, and it has to be expunged from street lighting. I can't say that more strongly. Can I have the next slide, please? So the actions that result from this growing understanding of the interaction of light with biology is, and this is not inconsistent with what Bob Misen said to start with, only illuminate where it's needed, only illuminate when it's needed, choose the lighting color explicitly to minimize the adverse biological effects. And most of those adverse biological effects are in the blue. Blue is not generally needed for good vision at night. You can see perfectly well at night with amber lighting. The old sodium street lighting, which people didn't like because they couldn't see any color, it was actually extremely good for nighttime illumination because it contained very little blue and it allowed you to see perfectly well. We have to eliminate blue from public spaces where color rendition is not absolutely essential, and it's not often really essential. So my finishing slide is just a reiteration. The next slide, please. This is the spectrum actually taken just outside my study here. I can actually see it from where I'm sitting, of one of the new street lamps in Bath. It's a 4000 Kelvin LED light. It's fairly well shaded, so it shines downwards, but it has this huge blue peak, which you can see very clearly here. That is absolutely unnecessary for street lighting, and it's doing untold damage. It's killing the insects. Although we don't really notice it, it's damaging our eyes, mostly our eyes. If it shines into our bedrooms, it will damage our eyes. And in particular, when you look at one of these, when you glance at one of these street lamps, the intensity of the radiation from the illuminated part of the lamp shining on your retina produces an irradiation intensity which does huge damage to your retina. So you should never look at these bright white lights because they really do damage you. The ambient light coming down and reflecting off other things doesn't do so much damage, but the direct light does. So my final message is, and my strongest message is, we have to get rid of this bright white street lighting across the planet, not just here, in all countries across the planet. And in order to do this, we have to convince the lighting manufacturers and we have to convince governments that we have to get rid of it because it really does a huge amount of damage. Okay, thank you. Now I'll hand on to Sophie Spencer from the Council for the Preservation of Rural England to talk about much nicer things than I've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That's really quite scary. So thank you. I'm the director of CPRE, Avon and Bristol, and we're now called the Countryside Charity. We've left the old name behind, and our local group covers the sort of Bristol and Bath area and all the surrounding countryside. So that's where we're mainly working. And I'm going to talk a bit about how and why CPRE engages the public with the problems of light pollution, both nationally and in our local area. So Charles, can I have the next slide, please? So why does CPRE care about light pollution? Well, we've been sort of one of the kind of leading voices in the campaign against light pollution for many years. And really our aim is to sort of reconnect people with the wonders of the night sky. And we feel that light, sort of darkness at night is one of those kind of key characteristics of rural areas. It's what makes our countryside special, and what makes it sort of different from towns and cities. And it's something that we want to sort of retain. But of course, as Bob pointed out so clearly, light does not respect boundaries. So it spreads for miles from the source, and it blurs that distinction between the town and the countryside. And so even in the depths of the countryside, those genuine dark, starry nights are becoming harder and harder to find. We've got the security lights, as we've heard, the floodlights, the street lights, and they all break into the darkness, and they are blurring that distinction between the town and the countryside. And of course, not only that, we've heard from how damaging light pollution is, harmful to wildlife, to our own health and our well-being, but also excess light is contributing to our carbon emissions. So it's really important that we really try and reduce light pollution in our urban areas as well. So can I have the next slide, please? So how do we engage with the public? So our biggest sort of light pollution campaign is our annual star count, and that happens every year. It's a survey of the night sky, and it started in 2007, and it's supported by the Commission for Dark Skies. And we ask star spotters to submit the number of stars they can see within the constellation of Orion. So that's not the 4 points at the corner, but everything they can see in between. And one of the reasons we do this is so the more people that can take part in this, in engaging with the night sky where they live, then the more interest and support there will be for some measures to reduce light pollution, if we can kind of get those agreed. And we use the results, so the public submit the results, and we take those results and we create an interactive map that anyone can access, and it shows how much light pollution is affecting our view of the night sky in different areas. And anyone can take part, and we can use it to compare light pollution levels at a fairly detailed level in our different areas. And that can help CPRE, our local groups. It helps any community groups, parish councils, or anyone really who wants to identify where light pollution is a problem and try and do something about it. And can I have the next slide, please? So the good news was that 2021 was our biggest ever star count. So despite it being very chilly, and we were in a coronavirus lockdown, the public broke records this year. So we had more people than ever submitting results to our star count, which was great. So we had over 7,000 people participating. And what we learned was, so 51% of our star spotters said they could see only 10 or fewer stars within the constellation of Orion. So that indicates that they're experiencing the worst, the severe light pollution. And 5% of stargazers could see 31 or more stars within that constellation. And that indicates that they are sort of in the most dark skies that we could expect. So actually what we found was 2021 saw a slightly lower reports of the worst kind of light pollution. So for example, in 2020, 61% of people were in the areas of severe light pollution. So there's a couple of possible explanations for this. Obviously, this is a citizen science project, so its comparisons year on year are a bit tricky because it's not particularly easy with different numbers of people counting in different areas. But it's possible that this was one of the impacts of a lockdown, the lockdown effect. Obviously, much of the country were in very strict coronavirus restrictions during the Star Count week. It was the 6th to the 14th of February this year. and possibly with quieter urban areas, fewer larger buildings in operation, maybe there was less glow or sort of leakage into our night skies. But I think the really important thing to remember is, as with the improvements we saw in the first lockdown in air pollution in cities, if this is a result of lockdown, then these improvements are probably going to be temporary. So as life kind of returns to normal, unless we put measures in place to tackle light pollution at a local level, we'll be going back to pre-2021 levels, if not worse. So CPRE will continue to do the star count, we'll continue to monitor and track light pollution. And can I have the next slide, please, Charles? So this is the example of the map. So if you look on our website, this is the interactive map of the star count. And you can put in your own postcode or somewhere that you like to visit, and you can see the people who have submitted the results in your area. So you can just about see that obviously in Bristol we've got a lot of red and reddish dots, and that means high levels of light pollution. And Bath, you can see there's a few more sort of yellowy ones, and that is slightly better. And if you look into the kind of the rural areas, you tend to get more of the sort of purpley ones indicating lower light pollution. But it's quite interesting to kind of put in and see what's happening where you are. Next slide, please. So also during lockdown, we ran some sort of free online work with local astronomer Jo Richardson of Space Detective. So she is one of 10 UK space ambassadors, and she's a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. So we ran these online programs, workshops for children and events for older children and adults. And they're really, really popular. And Jo took the children on a journey through our amazing solar system. And they learned about star constellations, about the planets, each of them in turn. And they also then became dark sky rangers. So they were learning how important it is to look after the night sky. So not just for now, but for future generations. And so if you go on to next slide, please. So these are some of the lovely photos that we were sent. And one of them is the light bulb, which is to remind people to turn off their own lights at home. So that was really, really nice to see how people could kind of tackle this just from their own home. So the very last slide, please, Charles. So I just put this one in because it's two views of Bath, and they're taken from the same spot. And the first one is taken in the 1950s, and you can see how dark the sky is. And the second one is from our CPRE report called Shedding Light, and that was taken around 2001, so the early 2000s. And yeah, you can see the difference immediately in the two vistas. So that's all from me. I've just, there's details there about how you can support CPRE. We're a charity, and everything is on our website if you're interested in supporting us. So thanks very much for listening.
Okay. Finally, over to me and about the Bath and Surround Starlit Skies Alliance. And this came about because I was, as I am now chairman of the Herschel Society, we were approached by a local wildlife group and by the Cotswold area of Occitan Natural Beauty. They said to us, look, we know you people, the astronomers, care about the dark skies. Well, we care as well, because we're increasingly aware of the damage to wildlife, bird life, insects, particularly invertebrates, that is caused by light pollution. Can we sort of join together to work together on this? And of course, we said yes, because obviously many groups agreed to combine, they can be much stronger. So we agreed to develop a campaign on light pollution impacts on animal and human health and well-being. And this is about Bath and surrounding areas. So we know for lots of dark sky parks, and Bob has talked about quite a few of them have been developed. We focused on what you can do in and around a city like Bath. So we organised conferences in 2017 and 2019 to raise awareness on these issues and gain momentum. And we involved, a huge range of people, because a huge range of people are involved. Local authorities set regulations as to how planning works. They decide their own priorities. They, of course, organize public lighting systems, and they're very influential in how their cities develop. We invited our MP, Vera Hobhouse, to our second one. She was very supportive. Local businesses, universities, schools, because these are major institutions that need light for good purposes, but also can use light badly. Residents groups, we're all residents, we all live somewhere, and Bath has a number of resident associations that gather together and work together to try and improve things. They too will be involved. Health and police officials. Health officials, because advice on public health is something that's very important for that, for them. And so they need to understand the impacts of bad light. Police officials. Bob Miser made the point at the start that more light doesn't necessarily mean more security, and the police can be very helpful about giving good advice about this. Architects, landscape designers. The buildings we live in, the places we live in, are designed by people, either consciously or unconsciously. So they have a lot to do to try and make sure we use light as part of that officially. Lighting suppliers, Bob Miser mentioned that, engineers and consultants. Most professional lighting suppliers are very aware of these issues. Trouble is the lights that one can all find at the B&Q, which have been nowhere near a good design process. And obviously local astronomy, wildlife and environmental groups, national groups, like the ones that Sophie and Bob represented, but also Bath-specific ones, Bath Preservation Trust. They are very interested in this. So are people who run Bath's existence as a World Heritage Site. And that's, the light pollution we have here has important, implications of that too. So one thing we produced from this was a film, which you can find on our website. Basically, it runs for half an hour, and it talks about how you can deal with lighting in a built environment. It's really aimed at professionals, lighting professionals, architects, public officials in local authorities, to sort of see how they can address the issue about light pollution and what to do about it. So I do recommend it. We also developed this image, which you saw in our publicity, trying to say it's for wildlife, wonder and well-being. And it's for both creatures and for people. And of course, for a good night's sleep at the end of the day. We also made use of something else CPRE did, which is a night blight map based on satellite imagery of the night, taken in 2015, I think it was. And you can find this on their website. And it really covers the whole country. And you can take a particular part of it. And of course, this is the Bath area. So essentially, red is very, lots of light pollution. Blue is very dark. And this is the familiar picture of the city of Bath. This is the centre of Bath. This is the industrial area, Locksbrook and so on. And this is Claverton Down. And guess what? It's the university. But also you can see around Bath, there's some quite dark areas. Bath astronomers, when they go observing, go to Willow down here, because the dark blue means it's quite a good sight. And it's quite dark up near the north as well. So for us, what we're trying to do is make sure the lighting is more sensible and more controlled within Bath, but also around the outside, then people who live in sort of semi-rural areas don't have to suffer the light pollution that comes from the city they live around. So that's a good way of marking how well we're doing. And what we have done more recently is to build on national developments. So the parliamentary report Bob Miser mentioned is very helpful as something we can use to get people to try and respond to. We've been linking with local authority plans on climate change. Baines have declared both the climate change and the biodiversity emergency. We have pointed out to them, we'll keep on doing it, that if they actually deal with light pollution, that can help on both. It can help reduce carbon footprint, but also the biodiversity thing does link to the effect of light pollution. If you can control light pollution, it'll increase the chance of our wildlife to survive. We're engaging with major local institutions on light pollution issues. And for example, University of Bath. Indeed, I have some hot news here. I had a meeting with University of Bath yesterday with a lighting engineer who's a retired past president of the Institute of Lighting Engineers. I think we persuaded them to develop a lighting strategy, so they haven't done before. And once you begin to think about lighting, that's the start of a good conversation. So let's see what happens, but for the moment, that looks like good news. The other good news story was Dorothy House, who all of you of a certain age in the Bath area will know a lot about, recently won a Good Lighting Award for an excellent lighting scheme they had in their car park. And we can use this as an example to other businesses of what can be done if you try. So always making opportunities to try and find allies and share experiences, such as today. And we're doing the same thing with the National Astronomy meeting in a month's time, where we're giving a similar talk on this basis to there. So that's the end of our pitch, basically. I'd like now to turn it over to you for your questions, your comments, and we will see where that takes us. So over to you. Now, I think the idea is if you put your questions in the chat, and I will pick them out and then invite the person posing the question to unmute and say what the question would be. So looking down it, Bob Meisen, and there's one from Andreas Vasmud, which is, Andreas, are you here? If he's not, I'll raise question.
I am. Thank you, Charles. It's not Andreas. I'm sort of using his account. It's me. Yeah.
Fine. Do you want what's your question then?
Well, first of all, thank you to all of you for a really outstanding and interesting talk. And as a layman, I found that absolutely fascinating. It was interesting that the direct health harms from some of the effects of the lighting we're having now felt to me as a real point of leverage for people campaigning to get changes in the law. And I just wondered if you agreed with that. Obviously, the aesthetics of wanting to end light pollution are clearly, would enhance all our lives. But it felt like the harms was a real pressure point on which we could push to campaign.
I'll first go at that and hand over to Bob, perhaps. I mean, I think so, yes. I think the difficulty with it is the science is still emerging, if you like. It invites the government to say, we agree there's a question, no more work needed. I think on wildlife, where the numbers are more obvious, where the decline in wildlife numbers is more conspicuous, and there's a great deal more completed work about it. So my own personal view is that the wildlife angle is the best one. But Bob Fosbury, do you want to have first go at that? And
yeah, I'll have a go at that. I think it's a very interesting question. The history is also interesting. I mean, the blue peak in these ubiquitous LED street lamps and domestic lighting is a result of the Nobel Prize for Physics being won in 2014 by a Japanese engineer who developed the method of making these blue LEDs and operating them in a very efficient manner. And they've become the main driver for most of the modern LED lighting. And the fact that it's blue in some sense is an accident, but it does give you the opportunity of making very white lights, which people quite like, but they shouldn't have them at nighttime. That's the point. So I think Charles talked about the effects on animals. So many research projects being done on animals like bats and so on to see how light of different colours affects them. And I think the point is now we know with great deal of certainty that blue light is damaging for animals. There are many experimental programs that have been run that have shown that shining blue light on animals at certain times of day in particular is very damaging. I mean, we do experiments on fruit flies and to some extent on other larger animals, including humans. where we can see that if you shine blue light on a batch of fruit flies, they live about half as long as they would normally. If you shine red light at certain times on fruit flies, they live about 20% longer than they would normally. So it's a huge effect. And this is true of other animals as well. We see similar positive, negative effects. In fact, you could take a line from Animal Farm and say, blue light bad, red light good. It's a very good general guide, in fact. The problem that Charles alluded to is that the science of understanding exactly how this works is very complicated. Well, it appears very complicated. To all biology, it's very complicated, but it's quite complicated. And we're only beginning to understand exactly the processes that go on to make this work. It took about 150 years for scientists to understand how photosynthesis worked, and they still haven't really got there in great detail. I mean, there are parts of photosynthesis which are still not understood. It's a very complex process. So understanding this in animals, lots of experiments, well, not enough experiments, but lots of experiments, but it's difficult. But I think we can say with a great deal of confidence that blue light is bad and red light is good. And I would say with great confidence that we should get rid of this blue light in street lighting, because street lighting is on at night. We don't need it. It is doing enormous amounts of damage. It may have some impact on costs, because other types of LED lighting perhaps are slightly more expensive. I don't know exactly how much, but the blue ones are well known and we have to get rid of them. I think there's another question later on, which perhaps I can come back to talk about the effects of domestic blue lighting, and I'd be happy to do that in a moment.
Okay, Bob Meisen, you had a point.
Bob, in a few words, if possible, what would you say to the minister who claimed a few days ago that artificial light is not one of the drivers of species decline?
Well, I would say all the indications are from experiments on various kinds of animals that it is, and a great deal of progress has been made over a recent, very small number of years in understanding why this happens.
Yeah.
I would probably say that the kind of interaction that the blue light generates from these LED lights is not dissimilar from the Chernobyl radiation that killed so many people at the time. It's a matter of degree. It's exactly the same process, and that might scare the pants off them.
Thank you.
I'm trying to pick up things, those little questions, and there's one from Days, D-E-Y-E-S. Do you want to voice your point?
Yes, it's Tony Dees. Tony Dees.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes, a very interesting set of talks, and what I had not appreciated before was the very strong links with climate change and the biodiversity aspects. Yeah. But my question was more a practical one, as I think I set out there in my chat. I live in Shaftesbury, and a developer has just been awarded a contract to develop 30 homes on the southern slopes of the Shaftesbury Bridge, right between the southern part of the town and Cranbourne Chase, which somebody mentioned is a dark night reserve. And I was just wondering what the channels are for people like myself, or if I could get a group going, to bring pressure to bear on who would it be, planning authorities, the developer, to ensure that the street lighting for this development is appropriate.
Bob Meisen, do you want to go at that? Or
Yes, I have been in exactly this situation. I live in Wimborne, which is on the other side of the Cranbourne Chase from Shaftesbury, and Wimborne currently has hundreds, possibly 1,000 new houses being built around its perimeter. Now, Wimborne is on the very boundary of the AONB, the Cranbourne Chase area of outstanding natural beauty, and some of these houses are between the main town of Wimborne and the AONB. And what we've done, partly as the Commission for Dark Skies, partly as local environmental pressure groups, we first of all approached the local council to try to get their mindset into getting light pointed downwards. And we recently gave a good lighting award to the local primary school who moved into new premises on the border of the AONB. Their lighting is not blue, pointed vertically downwards, and only comes on when there's somebody moving about in the playground. So most of the time it's off. That is ideal lighting. We've got to have lights, but let's have the right ones. So approach the council, approach the developer, and tell them that there are awards for good lighting. Tell them that a lot of government MPs are working hard to try to counter the negative effects of bad lighting. Tell them about 4000K and why it shouldn't be that hot, so to speak. And it's happening. A lot of these developments around Wimborne are putting in all the right stuff. The local football club, which was the worst polluter in town, as far as light's concerned, has been moved because of this development into a new site, and their lighting is wonderful. You can't see it when it's on from a distance. So talk to the developers, the council, anybody you can think of about the joys of good lighting. And believe it or not, people sometimes hear what you say.
Can I go on to David Worskett? Do you want to ask your question, or I'll do it for you?
No, can you hear me all right?
Yep, shoot, yeah.
I'm very interested in the way the sort of ecological chain works with some of this. It's been said jokingly that if you drive fast at night now, you pick up about half as many dead insects on your windscreen as you did in the 1970s. Sure. But I think I'm right, and I'd like to hear from somebody on the panel about this, that actually the damage to insect life by the extent of light pollution at night is sort of a stage in the process that then feeds through to a lot of other ecological damage, and that it often isn't understood. So that's one thing that interests me. And the other, more locally, if I can be risky, is to say, why on earth can't we do something about some of the more glaring examples of poor performance? There is a very large building on the hill overlooking the River Avon to the west of Bath, with glaring floodlights, which are lit, as far as I can see, all night, pointing upwards. And for 15 years, I looked at it and wondered why. And I just wonder whether we should be a little bit bolder in naming and shaming.
Yes, perhaps I can answer that question first. I did mention local resident associations. When I spoke to FOBRA, the group of resident associations, about this, I did say, look, this thing's in your hands. The law at the moment is not very helpful. It may change in time, but right now it's not. But these people are your neighbours. And if your neighbour has unreasonable lights, which he thinks are good architecturally or good for security, one of the best people to influence him is you. What I would say is that if you live in a part of Bath where you're particularly aware of this, and I know what you mean, contact them. Say, why is it your lighting is so bad? And if you can, get other allies around you. So I think local pressure, short of national action, is the kind of way you can do that, or at least make a start. On the other point about insect loss and so on, Bob, do you want to deal with that? Or
I'll say something about that.
Yeah.
First of all, I did mention the fruit flies that were being experimented on, and they're typical in that if you shine blue light on them, they lose energy, they can't climb up the insides of glass tubes, which were used in the experiments, and they don't live as long. Now, I've been outside I have a hot bin in my garden, which has lots of springtails around it at certain times of the year, and of course worms. If I shine a blue torch on springtails and worms, they go bananas. They try and hide as quickly as they possibly can. You can see that it makes them extremely uncomfortable. And the chemical that made King George III mad, he suffered from porphyria. This is the protoporphyrin that I mentioned in my talk, which is the precursor to the synthesis of chlorophyll and hemoglobin. Photodynamic therapists who kill cancers with light use those porphyrins, or used to use them before they developed better ones. They use these porphyrins for killing cancer cells. So light and porphyrins are used for killing. and the whole chain of insects will suffer from this damage if you shine blue light on them.
Add something there, please, Charles.
Please do, yeah.
There was a survey in Scotland in about 1990, and local councils were approached about the responses from people who had lights about which others complained. And they came to the conclusion that I think it was something like 80% of them immediately took action because, quite simply, they didn't realize they were causing a problem. And nearly all bad lighting that discomfits neighbors, etc., is just pure ignorance. People don't realize it's a problem. And once they're told, they will very, very often cooperate. And I think, sir, your big illuminated house may be suffering from this ignorance problem. They just think it's nice to see the building and they don't realize it has negative effects. I wonder if an approach like that might wake them up a bit.
I think that particular building is about to go through a change of use, as well as I understand it, to be turned into a rather swanky hotel. So perhaps we can persuade the new owners or managers to think a bit more about how they're impacting on their neighbours.
Yeah, a subtly lit building can be a joy to see, and one that's washed with bright light can be quite an eyesore.
I'm trying to, start the idea that actually part of Bath's appeal as a World Heritage Site city can be, the first dark skies city. Just imagine all this fantastic architecture we have around, which of course was built for the 18th century when there was much less public illumination, was still visible just very faintly, just glowing in the dark. It could look absolutely amazing, with a wonderful night sky ahead above it. So that's a vision for 10, 20, 30 years.
Can I add something here as well? Sorry.
Yeah, please do, yeah.
I was just going to mention some research that CPRE did a number of years ago now, but there's a report that's available on our website called Shedding Light, and it looked at some of the schemes that local councils were experimenting with to reduce light at night. So, for example, turning off the lights for a few hours at night, and also dimming schemes. And actually, the responses from local residents were generally really quite good. And I think the reason that councils haven't kind of continued to sort of do this, or it hasn't become more popular, is because we don't have enough, as Bob says, we don't have enough legislation or policy to incentivize that. So actually, local populations don't seem to mind. It is more about what we're used to and kind of what we just continue with.
And it's a very interesting fact that in just about all the areas where lights have been turned off at midnight, crime rates have gone down. Yes, down. There is no link between lighting and crime levels. Crime is a societal problem. It's not a lighting problem.
And if you go to our website, there you can see a couple of cases, inspiring stories of cities or village areas that are got together to actually tackle light pollution issues. One is about Duluth, Minnesota, in the Great Lakes in the States, and another group of villages in Austria. You can see the links on our website, and it's quite an inspiring story. So people can do things locally if they get together and have enough of them who want to do something about it. Now, there are no other questions, the new ones, in the chat. There are some comments. So I think if we have time for one more, maybe, possibly two, comments or questions about this whole area. So if you want to, the numbers are small enough, probably unmute and voice your question. We'll see how we can field it. Any takers?
Can I step in?
Deepa, is that you?
Yep.
Good.
Sorry, I didn't turn my video on because I didn't want to shock people. But the thing is, where I live in Camden Crescent, the council about 3 years ago introduced these awful, very bright white blue lights, which are doing the reverse of what they're meant to do, because they blind you and you can't actually see the cars. So basically they're they're doing the opposite of what they're meant to do. And when you mentioned, Charles, the lighting strategy, I think it ties up nicely. I mean, how can we get involved, and how can they be made aware of the negative aspect of what they've done?
Yes, I mean, sorry, the lighting strategy that I mentioned was the university. So when we went to see the university and we pointed out, the issues people had with their lighting, they said, well, they were doing a variety of things or planned them. And I said, well, fine, but they're totally invisible. So the idea of actually consciously stating what your policies on lighting and how you manage it, how you plan to improve it, is itself a very good thought process. So I think the university, I hope, will do that. The council is not. So if you talk to the council, they will give you a list of things they have done. And they will say that, that the new LED lights, for example, save a lot of money and they're well controlled, and they are reduced, they're dimmed at night time, all which is true. But unfortunately, the color temperature is about, as Bob has pointed out, is far too cold as we talk about it, which is confusing.
Yeah.
So I have asked them what it would cost to actually change the color temperature of their lights, so they were warmer and less damaging. And I haven't had an answer yet. So I think the more people who can join our effort to press the council to do things about this, the better.
I'd like to add my voice. And the other thing that I've experienced is when driving in the evenings, the new LED lights that the cars are now using on their headlights completely blind you.
That is shocking. It really is. Yeah.
It is.
There's a website, if I may interrupt, there's a website called Lightmare, not Nightmare, Lightmare, and it's all about LED lights on cars and why they're dangerous.
Yes, but I believe there should be a campaign and a voice to put to the government to help create a policy which will govern what kind of lights are sold to the car industry.
Yeah, absolutely true. I know several people of my generation who've given up driving at night because that they are dazzled, and the human eye, when it's aging, it takes a lot longer to readapt, etc.
Could I make a point here, Charles?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
I think the lighting industry is clever. It can make almost any kind of light you want. I think it's very important that we engage with the lighting industry in a positive way and tell them what we're doing and encourage them to develop better lighting. I mean, they can do it. There's no problem. It's got so deeply embedded in council decision-making that these very blue LEDs are very cheap to operate, they're very cheap to buy. We have to get to the lighting companies.
So how can we engage? How can we have that engagement, Bob?
Well, I don't know. It's difficult. I know it's difficult, and people say it's difficult. I talk regularly to a Silicon Valley entrepreneur in California who makes lighting for architects, for generating very clever interior domestic lighting, also lighting for hospitals and so on. So you can change the spectrum of the light during the day-night cycle. They're quite expensive, but they are interested in doing these things for special purposes.
Bob Myers, a newer point.
Yeah, can I say that the Commission for Dark Skies has been talking to every large lighting company in Britain for 30 years. There are many, many voices in the lighting industry who recommend caution. They talk about the precautionary principle, if it might do harm, don't do it. And the problem is that the customers don't know this. They want big, bright white lights because they're told that, or there's a myth, if you like, that they are better than subtle lighting. And all the while that there's a demand for big, bright white lights, they'll make them.
So there needs to be a campaign.
Thank you. We need to leave it at that. This debate will go on, doubtless, for many weeks and months. Thank you for taking part. Thank you to my panelists, Sophie Spencer, to Bob Misen and Bob Fosbury. Thank you to you, the audience, for your points and your questions. Please do follow up the links you've seen on the slides to our various websites where you can learn far more, and join local campaigns to try and deal with this problem. We can make progress if we all cooperate to actually make this a priority. So thank you all very much, and good night.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Bye.